History isn't just a straight line. It's more like a giant, messy tapestry. And sometimes, a single day on the calendar becomes a pivot point where human progress, big ideas, and pure creativity all slam together. December 4th is one of those days. It's a date that saw audacious beginnings that redefined life itself, the final thoughts of a man who shaped how we govern ourselves, and the accidental spark of a cultural revolution. It's a day of wild contrasts, where life, society, and art all crashed into each other in unforgettable ways. Let's travel back to Cape Town, 1967. Inside the Groote Schuur Hospital, the whole world was holding its breath. For centuries, the human heart was seen as untouchable, the sacred rhythm of life itself, way beyond a surgeon's reach. But on December 3rd, a tragic car accident created an unprecedented opportunity. A young woman, Denise Darville, was declared brain dead. Her still-beating heart was a vessel of life with no future. The recipient was Louis Washkansky, a 54-year-old grocer whose own heart was failing. The daring surgeon who would connect this gap between death and life was Dr. Christian Barnard. In the early hours of December 4th, as the surgery ended, something incredible happened. The transplanted heart began to beat inside another man's chest. It was a stunning moment that blurred the line between life and death. For 18 days, Louis Washkansky lived with someone else's heart, proving this wasn't science fiction, but a new, fragile reality. Although he eventually passed away from pneumonia, the barrier had been broken. Humanity had found a new way to challenge its own mortality, kicking off an era of transplantation that still raises huge ethical questions today. December 4th wasn't just a medical victory. It was the dawn of a new conversation about what it even means to be human. Now let's jump back a few centuries. While the 20th century saw us push the physical limits of life, on December 4th, 1679, the world lost a man who spent his life defining our political and social limits. On this day, the great mind of Thomas Hobbes went silent. His death wasn't a sudden event, but the closing of a chapter that completely changed the foundation of modern government. Hobbes had lived through the brutal English Civil War, and it convinced him that humanity's natural state was just constant conflict. Life, he famously said, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this chaos, he argued, people had to agree to a social contract. They had to give up some of their freedom to an absolute ruler, a Leviathan, in exchange for safety and order. It wasn't a very cheerful philosophy, but it was brutally practical. Hobbes's death marked a turning point, where his controversial ideas started to slowly weave themselves into the DNA of Western political thought. His work forces us to constantly ask that uncomfortable question, what is the right balance between freedom and security? So, this December 4th marks a profound loss, but also a moment when the ideas of an architect of our social order were set in stone, leaving behind a blueprint that nations would debate and build upon for centuries. Now for another sharp turn. If the heart transplant was a calculated creation, and Hobbes's legacy was all about structure, then December 4th, 1956 was a moment of pure accidental magic. A cultural lightning strike. The place? Sam Phillips's Sun Studio in Memphis, a humble little spot where the sound of a new generation was being born. The day was supposed to be a recording session for Carl Perkins. A wild young piano player named Jerry Lee Lewis was hired to play on the track, but then fate stepped in. Elvis Presley, the studio's biggest star, just dropped by to say hi. A little later, the deep, brooding voice of Johnny Cash walked through the door. What happened next wasn't planned. It was an impromptu jam session, a gathering of rock and roll gods for one brief afternoon. For hours they just played, trading verses on gospel songs and new rock and roll hits. A smart engineer let the tapes roll. The result is a priceless piece of history, not because it's perfect, but because it's so raw and real. It captures the exact moment a new kind of art was being shaped by its greatest young masters. This wasn't creation by design. It was creation by spontaneous combustion. The $1 Million Quartet session on December 4th is a monument to the power of chance, a moment when four titans unknowingly stood together at the epicenter of a cultural earthquake. A transplanted heartbeat, a political philosophy cemented, a musical genre immortalized. On the surface, these events have nothing in common but the date. But together, they show just how many different things the human journey is about. On a single day, December 4th, we see humanity fighting its physical limits, questioning its social structures, and giving in to its deep need for creative expression. It's a day that reminds us that history isn't just one story, but a whole collection of them written in operating rooms, in philosophical books, and in the joyous, wild noise of a Memphis recording studio. Each event is a distinct note, but together they form a complex, powerful, and deeply human chord. Thanks for watching.